Good evening. My name is Jake Harrigan. I'm joined here by my co-host Fernando Garci-Crespo. Welcome to another segment of Voting for Change.
Here today we have Ian Soutar. Ian is a small business owner, an activist, and a previous candidate in Coquitlam for the provincial election for the Greens. And we're very excited to have him here and to hear what his views are on proportional representation in this upcoming referendum.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show, Ian.
Yeah.
So how did you first hear about proportional representation? What was your first exposure with it?
Probably about as soon as I got into politics, because I was about 2015, right before the federal elections.
Right.
And I want to save some trees by fighting Stephen Harper. What's the only way that makes sense? With the Green Party, they're never going to get in. Why is that? Oh, because of our electoral system. So that's where I started to learn about, we start with first past the post, you see what's wrong with that, and then, well, what are the other options? Oh, proportional representation, like almost every other developed country in the world. So
Right, definitely. So for you, it wasn't even looking at these options as something on the bright horizon. It was just what was wrong with our current system.
Yes.
And that's what started you on this little journey.
Yeah, I mean, the Prime Minister did a fabulous job of getting it on everyone's minds and making them vote Liberal, and then we learned about it after the committee went across the entire country and got everyone excited. So we learned a lot about it in, I guess, in the last couple of years as well.
So what is wrong with first past the post? You said you first learned about what was wrong with our system.
There's a lot of really complex details that a person could go down, but simply put, there are more people not getting what they want than people getting what they want out of their government, which doesn't make any sense. You have a minority of the people making the majority of the decisions, which is not representative of the country. So if it's not proportional or representative, then it's the opposite, which is not good for democracy.
No, exactly. It seems to go against a lot of what we imagine to be the basic democratic values that we all hold dear.
Well, it makes sense if there are only two political parties in the system, or binary thinking. Yes, winner, loser, makes a lot of sense, but we're diverse people in this country with more than two ways of thinking. So as soon as we have that, the system breaks down.
Yeah, definitely. So you've got multiple candidates, multiple viewpoints that don't get expressed properly when you're trying to funnel them through this one mechanism, first past the post, which is our current system.
Yes, exactly. I think about not the last provincial elections, but the one before that, in Adam Olson's riding, he lost by a handful of votes. The next runner-up lost by a handful of votes, which means there were about 3 different directions that the system could have gone, and that means 2/3 of people didn't get what they wanted, which is really upsetting.
Right, you think in a system that should be represented in some way, but in our current system, no?
Not at all.
No.
Not at all.
No. So you're trying to actively change that. What has your journey looked like?
Well, I started getting engaged in the committee process when the Electoral Reform Committee was going across Canada. So fill out the surveys, which actually seemed to be pretty okay the first time around. Go and visit the town hall when the committee came to Vancouver. And that was pretty resounding in favor of PR. And then of course, then the Liberals didn't like the answers that they got, so they put out another survey that was really watered down, but I still tried to participate in that. And that was, even still, those numbers largely indicated that, yes, we want to move to a more representative system, and they blatantly disregarded that. So then we're just, enraged about just politicians being status quo politicians and just saying something, doing the opposite. So that really, when we got the opportunity to have a new government here in BC, I really pushed for that by running with the Green Party, because I couldn't vote for the status quo parties. This binary system is not really what I like to participate in. And then we got our new government, and they said, we're going to have a referendum. So now we're doubling down.
Right. So here we are.
Yeah.
And what are you actively involved in terms of groups, proponent side?
So obviously I'm really involved with the Green Party. I'm co-chair of the Young Greens of Canada, but I think this is a nonpartisan issue. So we're really stepping back from waving a particular color over top of it. So I've started working with a subsidiary of the Yes Coalition, BC Youth for PR. So that's young people trying to change the system.
We actually had Fraser, our last episode was with Fraser.
Yes, that kid is mad inspirational. So
yeah.
he called me up and I said, yes, obviously I'm going to be involved in that. And we're helping round up young people across the country and or at least, sorry, across the province. And certainly I've seen on campus at SFU and UBC and even University of the Fraser Valley that people don't even notice the Green Party banner. They just see proportional representation and sort of come forward like zombies.
Well, it's interesting though, because it's different. You talk about moving backwards from a partisan issue. Why is that? Because this is where we talk about electing representatives. Those representatives usually have parties. Why is it that you're talking about backing away from the parties when you're talking to people about PR?
This is the system we're all functioning in. I mean, the more conservative side might argue that this is not good for stability, but I would argue the opposite, that if you have people voting the way that they want to vote rather than voting against someone that they don't want, you're going to have a more stable base rather than people swinging to the left, swinging to the right. You're going to have more stability with the larger numbers, unless someone makes a crazy statement or something, or their policies shift wildly and people are upset about it. People are largely going to stay the way that they want to be, at least.
Absolutely. We hear about that a lot of the time, too, is the stabilizing effect that a lot of countries note when they move to a PR system, because a lot of the time people move towards the center. They're less pushed towards the sides, the extremes.
Yes.
But everyone is represented. So you go to places like Germany and you get these coalitions that you know that generally there's some kind of reassurance that if a policy that is popular gets passed, it won't get undone by the next government, because the parties in the middle who kind of become kingmakers will not go against the popular will.
Well, that's certainly the case as well. When you have those wild swings left and right, and government doesn't actually direct public servants, or sorry, individual parties don't direct public servants, it's government in general. These poor people just trying to do their job end up getting total different policy shifts, and then other people are lost through the cracks in that system, which is just so hard to stay motivated.
It is.
It's difficult, but we're moving forward, and there's a lot of discussion happening, which you must be excited to hear.
Yeah, no, the threshold's been set nice and low, and people already have a lot of experience with this. We're frustrated with the federal government for giving up on that promise, and certainly seeing that in other jurisdictions, Ontario, United States. We try not to go down that road, but people are really frustrated by that, and this is a really clear beacon in the more positive direction.
So as a Green, we often hear the Greens being the party that is more ardently supporting this issue. What is your experience within the party? Do you hear people wanting it because of self-benefit, or what is the things that you're hearing?
That's another fabulous reason to sort of take a step back from a partisan side, because obviously Greens would do better under a proportional system, because one of the most common things we hear at the door is, oh, I would totally vote for you, but you're not going to win. And which means people are not voting for what they want, they're voting against something that they don't want.
Right,
so
voting strategically, trying to make sure that their vote matters, which seems like it's a struggle in the current system.
Oh yeah, oh certainly. I mean, I know I had to run as a candidate provincially because I needed someone to vote for, because the other two parties I did not have any love for them at all, and certainly not, well, I mean, one of the candidates was nice, but our viewpoints were further away. So that's, I think, also under certain proportional systems, you could get to vote for both the party you want and the representative that you like in your region, because they might not necessarily be the same person. But definitely within the party, everyone's on board, and we've also, I think, largely, as a whole, we've tried to step back away from this as a partisan issue. So it's actually been kind of quiet for the Greens in BC because we're under different banners.
Exactly, which is good to see, because I think one of the things that people need to focus on with this issue is that it's not primarily about the parties, it's about moving power back to the people, back to the base.
Yes, I know our current premier certainly has said those words many, many, many times, but definitely across all places where I've canvassed since the word of the referendum has come out and bump into people in the NDP, and suddenly we've gone from the provincial elections where I don't say we were at each other's throats, but certainly there was some animosity there.
Tension.
Now we have a lot in common. We say, I mean, yes, we have things that we don't share in common, but let's not talk about that right now because we have this glorious referendum happening, and then from that come other things that, oh, you also like environmental protection or other things like that, or social progressive policies. So
Right, there's a little bit more collaboration across the lines.
oh yeah,
It pulls people together towards a center that they can agree on.
definitely.
So you talked about the Greens and the NDP, but what about outside of that? I mean, there are a lot of liberal or conservative voters federally and other ridings too.
Yes.
What is your take on how they feel about it?
So I certainly heard after the federal elections when it came out that our prime minister was going back on his promise that even though the Conservatives were not necessarily in favor of the system, they did agree that a politician should, keep their promises, especially if they said them over 2,000 times. But largely what I hear from, certainly from my own MLA, as much as I love her, I disagree that this would give rise to hate groups or suddenly these radical fringe organizations. Greens have actually been fringe for a really long time. So
Yeah, what's the definition of a fringe
exactly.
group?
But this is the language that comes out. We have these fringe groups that are more radical coming out and taking seat in the legislature. But I personally would rather see them in a more professional zone rather than right now, which is under the covers in the dark, causing trouble and making all sorts of issues where we can't even reason with them because they're very well hidden from the rest of society. Or, I mean, they've been largely blocked out of it. So the only other argument I hear is that it's too complicated. We need to stick with the simple system. But honestly, I just learned about dual member proportional this morning. It took 5 minutes on YouTube. So
There's some great videos out there that people can use to get educated if they want to.
It's certainly condescending to British Columbians and Canadians overall, saying you couldn't possibly understand this
exactly.
system.
But what about New Zealand? New Zealand did it. There's tons of other countries that in the last 2 decades have moved towards a PR system. Are we saying that we're not as smart as these people? I think that's insulting.
And Canada is one of the countries with the highest percentage of people with university degrees and education. And BC is, out of Canada, the most educated province. So
we don't need to be overly boastful about how intelligent we are, but we're certainly on par with the rest of the developed world.
Like, I have talked to middle-class students about it and even lower, and they understand the basic gist of it. And it's
because they've taken the time to go and explore the options. So I think what we really want to tell people, what we want to impart to them is, don't be put off because it's always being said that these are too complicated. Take the time, go investigate them for yourselves, and then come to a conclusion on your own.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of good resources, like you said, where you can go out and you can take this information in and process it.
I mean, I certainly need the help of an animation to understand how votes are allocated under single transferable vote. But when you see the animation, you go, oh, that makes perfect sense. And then, I mean, when we think about it, really, it turns out that a lot of Canadians don't actually understand first past the post, or they think that we already have a proportional system. So if we really want to be attacking education, let's start with where we're at right now.
With where we're at.
And you hear that a lot when we were street canvassing in the car-free day. I was talking to people and saying, the same thing that elected the person to the south is the same system that we use, and people are like signing against it. And the moment you don't frame it with like first past the post and things like that, but you just frame it's a system that doesn't work, it's the same system that is causing a lot of trouble, people really change that idea of the words that they don't understand. And you were talking about fringe parties and how you don't think it's so big of an issue, and do you think the 5% threshold was a good idea then?
I mean, I would have to, I guess we'll find out, really. So it sounds reasonable. Federally, the Greens certainly poll on an average of 4 to 6%, so that is kind of around the area we think. We've been mobilizing for several decades now as an official organization, so I can't really imagine, say, anti-immigrant organizations popping up in the next year or so and having such a rally behind them.
Not with having those kinds of numbers. I mean, first of all, it's very unlikely that groups like that would be able to mobilize and get to the 5% threshold. And the other problem is, if they do that, there's a larger societal problem that we need to be dealing with.
Exactly.
Certainly. And I know, at least on a local level, we have anti-hate speech laws, and really that just means we need to get our politicians more educated on that, because if we have organizations popping up like that and are unchecked, that's more symptomatic of the system, not necessarily the people themselves. So I say, we have laws against that. Why aren't we acting on them?
That's definitely a fair assessment. I have a question for you then. In terms of protecting minorities and vulnerable sections of the population, what does PR do for these people compared to our current system?
I would say that it probably brings them more to the forefront and gets them help. For starters, with more stability in our government, we're going to have more stable funding going to the places that they need to go, and certainly within an electoral process, we see across the world that a proportional system brings out more women, more trans people, more non-binary folk, and so forth, certainly people of color, and that's going to strengthen our society internally as well. And I think as well we see, I mean, young people especially, right, which we're not actually a minority or even a fringe group anymore. We're the largest voting group next year, and I think since we're largely considered apathetic, I don't believe that for a second. I see we're frustrated and uninterested in participating in something that doesn't seem to work. We'll make it work, and we're going to be out there and participating. I think the same will follow with all the other groups as well. Certainly within the Green Party, we preach social justice, and giving us an extra leg up is going to see more opportunities to rectify the issues with our society around those groups.
Absolutely.
You were talking about stability, and now moving towards something that maybe the no side or people who may vote liberal or conservative would be worried about. You're a small business owner, you own a landscaping company. How do you think having PR and what you said with stability will affect small businesses in BC?
I mean, my business is extra small, so I don't usually get to see a whole much of red tape and so forth, but I can easily imagine that any organization that needs consistent funding for either fair wages or other things that you might get government assistance from, or even just consistent tax rates, we're going to see stability with that over a longer period of time. I really feel like when the conservative side comes out barking about stability, they're looking at it within like a 3 to 4 year time frame, which that's very narrow-sighted in my mind.
Yes.
We're looking at the big picture here. We're looking at not just the next 10, 15 years, but like 5, 6, 7 generations down the road. I think if businesses know that they can expect things to remain stable politically for a long term, we're going to see, especially with organizations coming from outside of the country, even Kinder Morgan, for example. If we had stable government, we might not be in the situation we're in now. But here we are.
There you go. But even for the short term, when you look at the kind of stability that people look for from government, not necessarily just with business, but if we look at the states, the way that power tends to flip-flop from the extremes to the extremes, with sides undoing the work of the previous government. We could look at DACA, all of the deportations that are going to be happening. All of these issues and all of this money that's being wasted based on flipping from extreme to extreme. Obviously, that's not very productive if you're trying to have any kind of business or be an entrepreneur in that environment.
Certainly not. Certainly not. We saw that with our conservative federal government. They were there for a decade and warming up the system for these fossil fuel companies to come in. We switched to a liberal government that arguably isn't that much more liberal than the Conservatives, at least with respect to pipelines, versus the provincial government here in BC. We were very conservative before, switched to a progressive government under the Conservative government. We said, yes, we're going to approve this pipeline. And as soon as the provincial government, as soon as the progressive government comes in, we say, no, we're going to just look at that again. And now we've created so much confusion. And we haven't even said, absolutely no, we can't do this, because we're not even sure if that's our jurisdiction. But we're not there. We can't even find out about that because we've got this switch in federal government, the switch in provincial government, and now we've got these municipal government elections that are coming up.
So far from the middle. There's no clear trajectory.
No. When you've got these majority governments, which one could argue are more successful at enacting policy within the short term, they the only option really is to switch back and forth unless we can get a minority government, which is really not very common under first past the post.
And there tends to be a bit of a stigma about that, at least in Canadian politics, talking about minority governments, that they're unstable, that they tend to fall apart, that they don't get things done.
I would just argue that that person has not looked very hard at our history. We got public health care or universal health care under a minority government, one of the hallmark Canadian trademarks. And
I'm not here to argue against you, but there does seem
not.
to be a sentiment floating around, especially when we talk to people just on the street. People, they tend to feel fearful that would lead to destabilization. But according to you, and I think from what we can see, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, we're a solid year into, it's not a coalition government per se, but certainly a minority-supported government, and I don't see anything happening to them anytime soon.
Right, now the ground is still here beneath our feet. We're still standing and breathing.
Absolute worst case, we have to go have another election, which, I mean, we certainly don't want to cause voter fatigue, but we only vote 3 times every 4 years. It's not that big of deal. It's not like down in America where you have the primaries,
your by-elections, the whole shebang. No, it's different.
And the thing is that where you go to the CBC and you get the promise tracker with all the promises that were kept and not. The latest, last week it showed, the Liberals and a majority government keeping 16% of the promises. And now if you go into the NDP, a minority government provincially, it showed them keeping 3/4 of the promises. And that is with a government that needs to seek approval for almost everything they do from the Greens. And on the other hand, they can do whatever they want, but they just chose that. And it shows you, that having a party in the middle to hold people accountable is key to them staying on track.
Yeah, I think there is indeed a lot of fear about minority governments. I don't think it's based on a whole lot of really solid evidence. I mean, maybe in theory, the idea that you could be having an election every year or something, that sounds awful. But
it sounds awful. But is that the case?
I haven't seen that happening anywhere.
No.
Definitely not.
Fingers crossed. But we seem. I mean, certainly my experience within the BC Greens, we're far more dedicated to keeping government steady for the next 4 years, just to prove that this thing can work. I mean, at the end of the day, especially with things like Site C or Kinder Morgan, I mean, if it doesn't work out with the NDP, it's not like it was going to work out any better with the BC Liberals. So I think it makes far more sense to hold on to that before just tossing up our hands and saying, let's have another election.
It keeps parties pragmatic. It keeps parties, realistic on what they can achieve in the long term. And you get leaders that are stable and that are effective, like in Europe, It's less debt because they know they're pragmatic in what they can achieve. And it's not, keeping saying we're going to cut all the taxes, but we're not going to cut the services, and then you go into debt. Or we're going to increase all the services, but we're not going to increase our revenue, and then you go into debt. And that is what happens in Canada, and the United States, and the United Kingdom, where you have some of the highest levels of debt per capita, whereas you go to Nordic countries or Germany or New Zealand, and you see that they need to show some kind of financial proof for the parties in the middle to form coalitions with them. It really makes you be smarter politics.
Right. It's a coming together over base economic issues and having an understanding that regardless of which way you sway in the next election, you need to be set up.
Yeah.
And that, in the end, serves the people best.
Yes. I mean, preaching to the choir, but yes.
I know, I'm talking to you.
Yeah. Well, so thank you very much for coming. We had a great time with you, and hopefully we can continue being involved in the upcoming referendum.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really stoked to see 2 fellow young people engaged in politics, helping to get other people engaged more in politics, and it's a very exciting time for our province. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on the show, Ian. All right, that's it for us on this segment of Voting for Change. We'll see you next time.